you all for being here today. It's such a pleasure to be in a place where it's cooler inside than outside. It's a little confusing for those of us from Canada. And when you walk outside, you feel like you might need a snorkel in order to survive. No, but really, I'm really pleased to be here. I got an invitation to come here, and I kind of had to chuckle because they were asking me to talk about Y2Y and the lessons that we have learned in this region. And the reality is, it's a circle of learning. I came here to learn. And in fact, the story of Y2Y originates right here in Florida. Reed Noss and some of the other professors here in this state had done this greenways analysis, trying to figure out how wildlife might move through Florida. And this guy, Harvey Locke, kind of got a hold of the idea and invited Reed and a bunch of other scientists who were interested in this idea of connecting landscapes together to create the Y2Y vision. And it all comes back around, and I was just talking to Carlson Ward, who you're gonna hear from later, saying that he was then inspired by Y2Y because it had a catchy name and created the idea of Florida Wildlife Corridor that could be sort of understandable by regular citizens in Florida. So it's a circle of learning. So let me get going here. Y2Y is a region, it's a place where we still have most of the species and most of the ecological processes fully functioning in that region. It's a huge region, 2,000 miles long, and the idea behind it is to connect and protect it so that both people and nature can thrive now and into the future. From the very beginning, it's about using an evidence-based approach, using the best available information, and working collaboratively. So we've worked with more than 700 different entities, for-profits, nonprofits, government agencies, First Nations, Native Americans, local communities, and many, many more. It's about working together, a theme that we've heard about today. And we also mostly work in the Y2Y region, but we also work nationally and globally. Why? In a really precise way, we need the enabling framework at the global level, at the national level, to get our work done locally. So I love this graphic. This is about Pluie the wolf. She's part of the origin story of Y2Y. She was collared just south of Banff National Park, and she jaunted across 2 countries, 2 provinces, 3 states, 30 different jurisdictions, public lands, private lands, all sorts of different kinds of lands. And what do we learn from her? We learned from her that the 20th century focus on protected areas is important, but not adequate if you want to sustain animals like her. Another way you can look at the Y2Y region is our quintessential grizzly bears. So how many of you knew that grizzly bears used to be in Mexico? They were all the way down there, that lighter pink. And by the 1920s, there were all of these small populations that are shown there in brown. All of those populations that were isolated went extinct. Eventually someone shot them. There wasn't a breeding female. Something happened and they went extinct. And the only one left is that little red isolated population of Yellowstone. Our job, you can sort of see the Y2Y region, is to reconnect them. They were 150 miles apart, now they're 40 miles apart, we're getting there. The other thing about Y2Y and those early meetings, I'm not gonna ask y'all where you sit on this because I know it's hot in Florida. We're over on the left. But you know, the reality is the north-south mountain range offers a lot for climate adaptation, right? Species can move north, they can move to different elevations, they can move to different slopes and aspects. And what we're doing there around growing protected areas, connecting them and reducing stressors, fundamentally is a response to climate change. So how do we get our work done? We talked about best available information. Sometimes that's local communities, indigenous communities, Western science, it's the whole gamut. And then, of course, collaborating, the very thing that we start practicing in about preschool. So what do we need to get done and to actually realize the Y2Y vision? There's 3 ingredients I'm going to tell you about. So the first one is about creating large protected areas, okay? So Y2Y has increased its protected areas by 80% in the first 25 years. That gets us only to 18%. The world has agreed on 30%, so how are we going to get those extra 50 million acres? We think we can do it. So here's where we're at in the first 25 years. The light green is what was there in 1993 when the vision of connecting and protecting the area was created. And the darker green areas like the Boulder White Clouds down in Idaho all the way up to Nahanni and Nazi Cho, those are the newer protected areas. We already have an agreed upon 14 million new acres in the last couple of years that are agreed to by federal agencies, the regional agencies, and Indigenous people. Yeah, that's right, Indigenous people. All of the protected areas that are going forward in the Y2Y region are with Indigenous leadership. We have a dozen new proposals from Indigenous leaders that amount to more than 35 million acres of new protected areas that they want to see their territories permanently protected. Our job as conservationists is to support that to happen. So right now, 1/4 of all the protected areas in the Y2Y region are managed by or co-managed by Indigenous people. We're going to get there together. So what's the second ingredient? Connectivity, wildlife corridors. And so to achieve this, really in the Y2Y region, it's about 2 things. It's about private lands, and it's about getting wildlife across roads. How familiar does that sound? That picture right there of the wildlife structure going in, that's the first overpass outside of a national park in Alberta. And my daughter, she drives there a lot, and she goes, God, Mom, would you get rid of your traffic jam? So what does Y2Y do? Y2Y works with a host of land trusts. And over the years, we've helped support 490,000 acres of sometimes measly little parcels of private lands that are in the valley bottoms, because for us, the public lands are on the mountains, the private lands are in the more productive valley bottoms, and the animals have to cross. This includes the biggest land deal ever in the United States called the Legacy deal that the Nature Conservancy led in Montana, and it was in part inspired by Y2Y's vision. Wildlife crossing structures, great. I love this. This is the best part. It says 117, but we're now up to 130 large mammal corridors. These are overpasses and underpasses specifically built for wildlife to get from one side of a road to the other. And the thing about them is that they work. So the most well-studied crossing system we think in the world is in Banff National Park, where there are 44 wildlife crossing structures. And we know they work. They reduce deer and other hoofed animal roadkill by 96%. Some of the animals still get on the roads. We talked about this a little bit today on our I-4 underpass visit that bears sometimes like to crawl over. We're working on putting in electrified fences in those places, which seems to keep them off. We are working on normalization of putting crossing structures in, but that's not always the case. This is an example of Lingenpolter, one of my favorite bears, knocking back and forth. The 2 colors are 2 time periods, but it knocked against the Interstate 90 over 40 times. Talk about persistence, and it finally made it over on my far left on that picture. So we've got a ways to go. Yellowstone to Yukon doesn't sound the same if you call it I-90 to Yukon, so we got to fix that. So we got some busy roads we gotta fix still, but we, as a collection, know how to do that. One of the places that we're working and seeing normalization of wildlife passages is in British Columbia. What we know is that basically every time a road is being considered for something, maybe expanding it or fixing it, they're putting in wildlife crossing structures. This map is 9 new structures that are going in southeastern British Columbia, including one wildlife overpass, and it's getting a lot of attention. And you know, that you're gonna hopefully hear from Beth Pratt, who's somewhere here in the audience. Woo! And you know, she is one of those people who has helped launch and normalize wildlife crossing structures out in California and really around the world. And so has Florida, so is Y2Y, and it's so, so important. On the next map yet? I guess I'm not. Oh, that went too far. Okay. Well, anyway, we're going to stay here. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the science. I'm not going to go into super geeky details like about gametes and propagules, but I will just talk about this map. There's a guy, Michael Proctor, who was looking in this case at grizzly bears. And it used to be that these grizzly bears shared their genes. They were indistinguishable across the region. But today, those yellow lines around there are distinguishable genetic populations. That means they're getting isolated. There's a lot of really small populations right around the border of the US and Canada. This is not good. And our job is to reconnect them, okay? And notice that if you look really closely, those dotted lines are mostly along roads, because roads come with development. So we can ask the scientists, and we did, including Michael Proctor with his back to us right there, working up a bear, where are the most important places where we can focus on reconnecting? So he came up with these yellow blobs, right? And then we drove out in the region, luckily with his Tesla, because he was basically looking off the road to where the wildlife would cross. But we managed to stay on the road because, you know, Tesla is actually correct when you're about to fly off the road, it turns out. So we created a collaborative of 60 different groups working in the transboundary region, and we reestablished connectivity in all 4 of those places. And we know it because Michael continued to follow those grizzly bears, and they moved across these places. We also purchased some key parcels in those valley bottoms, and we restored some of the corridors. And then I'll talk more about it later, but trying to remove attractants to keep bears alive is an important part of bears moving across the landscape. We thought we were going to get to 100 bears on the US side in a place called the Cabinet Yaak, because there was only 10 in the 90s. Today there are 60, and the cool thing is they're dispersing everywhere. That's suggesting that we did it. The habitat is full. So that's an example of the kind of stuff we do. Oh, thank you. So that's a model, right? It's really easy to say things are modeled, but the harder thing is then to apply the model. And that's what we're doing now. So if you remember, that work was in the border region of Idaho, western Montana, and British Columbia. Now we're taking the models that were developed, again, grizzly bear, wolverine, other scientists, that show us where are the priority corridors for animals to move between sort of the border bears down to the Yellowstone bears. So this is called circuitscape modeling. It really is electrical circuit theory applied to wildlife. How cool is that? So we can tell where that is. And from that, we were able to work with the scientists to pick 15 key areas that we need to make sure wildlife can get through, right? So we figured it out. That's 65,000 acres. That's it. That's kind of doable. And some of the key busiest roads, like that I-90 that I showed you earlier, have to be mitigated. Right there, that's a package that all of us as humans can understand, get, and it's reasonable. So I've talked about 2 ingredients: protect, connect, and then there's this thing, it's called humans. God, wouldn't conservation be easy without them? But this is the key thing, right? Is nature-positive communities. You know what? I think that if the people who lived in Yellowstone to Yukon region knew that it was the wildest large landscape in the world, and the people visiting that area, then maybe it would be easier to make the case that nature is the best use. So that's what we're working on is, how do we ensure that communities are living with and actually promoting nature-based economies and nature-based activities for the long term. So I'll just say a few things. We divide our world into rural and urban. So the Blackfoot Challenge is an example, it's a great model of how rural communities can coexist with these toothy, sometimes hard to live with carnivores. So that particular picture is something called a range rider. This guy having a person on a landscape with cows is a way to deter conflict with large carnivores. So our job is to take what is an incredible model, not just the range rider program, but many other tools that they've sort of developed and proved in that region, and spread it across. Why isn't it in the next valley over? Why isn't it throughout the Y2Y region? How can we move the policies in order to get the Blackfoot Challenge everywhere at scale? The second is the urban areas, right? So occasionally, like Banff, where this little cougar snack picture is from, is the gold standard. Again, it's a great model where we see human-wildlife coexistence happening, right? We had 12 grizzly bears a couple of summers ago in the little town of 14,000 in Canmore. They were waiting for the snow to melt, and everybody did the right thing. The grizzly bears were happy, the people were happy, and the snow melted, and up they went to go get their food. That is a coexistence community. But there are too many communities in the Y2Y region that aren't coexistence communities. And again, our job is to get it to scale through things like the Mountain Town Planners Summit and other mechanisms so that as a whole, people are ideally living with pride. They kind of feel badass for living with these large carnivores. So we'll get there. So the last thing goes back to the beginning, which is, how do people know about Y2Y? How do people know about Florida Connect? Sometimes it's things like the West Wing show, the Bluey's Trek. They called us an audacious idea in 1993. And they showed that picture of the wolf going around. You can see Grey's Anatomy has a nice poster of us. We had nothing to do with that. We don't know why it's there. So sometimes it happens on purpose and sometimes it doesn't. Those 2 books on the left, Kim Stanley Robinson and Doug Chadwick, who's a Nat Geo writer, they wrote their books. They never talked to anybody at Y2Y. They just wrote them. So Kim's is an incredibly good but depressing book about climate change where Y2Y is part of the solution. And Doug Chadwick talks about the biodiversity decline and his thoughts on how to solve the biodiversity crisis. Well, I think that Florida Corridors Connect and Y2Y have figured it out. And so does Doug. It's about large landscape conservation. How do we know that it's the right thing? Because we can see the progress. An increase in land protection of over 80%, an increase in the size of protected areas, which we may know make them more robust, especially during this time of climate change. An increase in connectivity, such as the wildlife crossing structures and the restoration of animals like grizzly bears. We have a lot more work to do, but we're headed on a positive trajectory, and we should feel hope. So I'll end there and just say it's really a pleasure to be here to learn from all the work that's going on in Florida and in Mozambique and around the world. Thank you.